Today on our podcast, we continue our story of Larry Watkin and Walt Disney as the Disney studio moves from animation into live action, creating films to compete with Warner Brothers, MGM, and Paramount. Already, we've looked at Watkin's early work on An Irish Story About Leprechauns, a project that in the early 1950s remained unmade. We've also looked at Treasure Island, the studio's first live-action production, and when we left off, the UK Disney team, which included Larry Watkin, Perce Pearce, and director Ken Anakin, was beginning to film Robin Hood and His Merry Men. Though now the Disney studio presents these films largely as the vision of Walt, in actuality, the decision to produce individual titles was carefully negotiated between Walt and Roy, who largely considered how a particular film might be received in the various domestic and international markets. These topics were also arranged around material which could best be developed by Larry Watkin. And so today, as we jump back into our story, we are in 1951, 4 years before Disneyland, 3 years before the weekly Disney anthology TV show, and 2 years before Disney produced a live-action feature in America. We're mostly in England as work continues on Robin Hood. And so if you're ready, here we go. The production of Robin Hood in England took about 9 months, from the point where sets were designed to the point where shooting wrapped. It was a more expensive film than Treasure Island, but Roy Disney felt it was worth the investment. Walt's primary criteria was whether or not he liked a story. From there, he assumed that most Americans would like it as well. But Roy looked at live-action production from a slightly different perspective. Roy understood that international distribution was the key to maximizing a film's profits. He believed that though Walt had an uncanny knack to intuit how Americans would react to a film, he was less accurate when imagining how overseas audiences would react as well. At least initially, when Walt brought up story ideas that related to American classics, such as The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Roy redirected him to classics such as Robin Hood that were more familiar to a European audience. In terms of historical dramas, Roy felt that topics related to British or European history would play well both at home and overseas. Other story genres that he believed would do well with both a domestic and an international audience were slapstick comedies and action adventures, both of which proved successful for other studios. If stories were set in a historical America, Roy sensed that they should relate to key American experiences such as the Revolution, the Civil War, or the westward expansion, which were phases of American history taught in European schools. In this, Roy was repeatedly looking at categories that had strong business potential when adapting Walt's interests to fit those areas. Robin Hood, he believed, was a good bet. Aside from second unit shots, most of the film was shot at Denham Studios. This picture took 20 weeks to shoot in the studio, director Ken Anakin explained. Walt came back to Denham about 3 times, and what would happen was that he would watch a little bit of the shooting, and then he heard about a model railway, a very special model railway a man had in Beaconsfield, which was about 6 miles away from Denham. Though Anakin didn't yet understand Walt's interest in model railroading, he understood that Walt had quite an elaborate garden railroad at his California home, set up in his backyard. Still, he was curious as to why Walt focused so much of his attention on this unusual hobby, a personal railroad large enough to ride by sitting atop boxcars that moved past various miniature dioramas and even through a tunnel. At one point during production, Anakin noted, Walt spent nearly a week with this man with his model railway. Only later would Anakin understand that this obsession with 1/8 scale writable trains was one of the many activities that moved Walt toward Disneyland. Most everyone recalled that Robin Hood was a difficult and long production. Richard Todd, who played the lead, was shorter than most actors in the film, including the actress playing Maid Marian. Todd often had to be stood up on an apple box, Anakin recalled, or walk a plank beside Maid Marian so that one didn't notice the discrepancy in height. Though the film wasn't focused on action sequences, it did include a few. Disney tried to talk Todd into having a stand-in for the rough-and-tumble scenes, one reporter explained, but Todd insisted on doing all the action scenes himself. Disney finally agreed. In one scene, Todd wore a special backplate covered with cork and slipped under his shirt. As he swam across the moat, from outside the view of the camera, a sharpshooter fired an arrow at Todd, which hit his backplate. Once he felt the thud, Todd turned over in the water, creating a believable impression that he had been hit and wounded by an arrow. Only once the cameras were off did the crew notice that the sharpshooter nearly missed the cork-lined backplate. The arrow, with its metal tip, was less than an inch from the edge of the protective plate. At times, Anakin thought that a more athletic actor might have been a better choice for the lead, but he was also aware that Todd fit a cultural need, something of which Disney was likely unaware. Some UK residents were tired of seeing British heroes played by American actors in recent Hollywood films. As Anakin put it, if you had a British hero, you shouldn't have an American playing him. Even if Richard Todd lacked a certain stature and athletic prowess, as he was born in Ireland, his appearance in this picture would play well for local audiences who believed local heroes should be played by actors who at least came from the region. Toward the end of shooting, Walt, again in England, visited the set. When he arrived, he found a few technicians standing around the edge of a soundstage, singing a song about how their paychecks were late. It was, he saw, a protest song. Walt discovered that there had been a small delay in pay that week, which caused the crew to work slower. Walt stood before the unhappy workers, a grin widening across his mouth until he had their attention. He explained that he would fix the situation and fix it quickly. "Well, okay, fellas," he said. "I'll go rob the rich and pay the poor, but for Pete's sake, keep this show rolling. I'd like to come back to the UK with another picture next year." Unlike Treasure Island, Robin Hood was not edited in England. Instead, as Anakin explained, the whole material was shipped to Burbank for final editing as usual. It was dubbed personally by Walt Disney, with Perce Pierce, the line producer, sitting beside him, throwing in the occasional good idea. This, everyone was sure, would work far better than Pierce creating his own unusable first cut in England. The other picture to which Walt had alluded with the technical crew was already being planned and scripted as Robin Hood finished production. This film would also expand out the number of individuals who regularly worked on Disney projects in the UK. In addition to regulars such as producer Perce Pierce, writer Larry Watkin, matte painter Peter Ellenshaw, and composer Clifton Parker, Walt hired director Ken Anakin, art director Carmen Dillon, and makeup artist Jeffrey Rodway, as well as actors Richard Todd, who had played Robin Hood, and James Robertson Justice, who had played Little John, essentially creating a UK production company. This new project, eventually called The Sword and the Rose, was based on a late 19th century novel called When Knighthood Was in Flower, the story of how Mary Tudor, the brash sister of Henry VIII, wins the right to marry a commoner of her choice by first agreeing to a political marriage with the elderly Louis XII of France. The novel had been previously made into a silent feature starring Marion Davies back in 1922, a picture that Walt had seen as a 21-year-old animator living in Kansas City. Larry Watkin, who did not love the source material, saw the coming storm. Walt had seen Marion Davies do it when he was at an impressionable age, and he never recovered from the impression it made on his adolescent mind. And Roy, who repeatedly persuaded Walt from adapting Mark Twain's novels for the screen, believed that a story that involved the history of England and France would likely appeal to audiences in America, the UK, and continental Europe. That is, this story met the two major selection criteria. It was a story that interested Walt and therefore presumably would interest an American audience, and it was topically arranged to meet Roy's requirements of gesturing to an overseas market. Director Ken Anakin quickly saw one of the key problems. It has dance sequences in it, he said. It has fighting sequences in it. It has great entertainment things, but it's all for adults. That is, this story wasn't necessarily for families with kids. The highlights of the story, as Anakin saw it, were largely centered around political intrigue as Mary Tudor manipulates her brother the king so that ultimately she gets what she wants. Surprisingly, this idea of manipulating influential people to get one's way appealed to Walt. When Anakin explained his reservations, Walt replied, "To hell with it. I'm going to make a picture that really reflects my views and my experience of coping with powerful people." Though the picture ultimately was about Mary Tudor persuading the king to let her marry someone outside of royal circles, in Walt's mind perhaps, the drama reminded him of battles he had had with Roy and various bank managers when he wanted to produce expensive animated features such as Snow White or Cinderella. Larry Watkin's reservation about the source material was that it was corny. The story of Mary Tudor wishing to marry an average person. Moreover, he didn't believe that the figures of Henry VIII and his sister would have the same type of audience draw as Robin Hood, which rose to the level of legend, or Treasure Island, which was a canonized classic. Lastly, he felt that the subdued romantic material of a novel published in the previous century wouldn't connect well with a contemporary audience. Still, he understood that it was his job to transform the novel into a script that would play well on screen and interest a large audience. "I worked like a Trojan to make it palatable," he said. The narrative challenges were both large and fairly straightforward as far as Watkin was concerned. The novel was nowhere near as well known as Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson or The Legend of Robin Hood, but the story did have a natural structure. Mary Tudor wants to marry a man she is forbidden from marrying. Beyond this, the historical figures such as Henry VIII and Mary Tudor were easily recognizable, particularly for a UK and European audience. Everyone on the project understood that The Sword and the Rose fell slightly outside of the formula for the first two Disney UK films. "We'll gamble," Walt told one of his producers. "It'll be period, but we'll gamble." For The Sword and the Rose, Watkin immersed himself in the details of 16th century British life to better understand the characters and their world. He familiarized himself with the food of the period, with the architecture of Windsor Castle, with the weapons and rich costumes and sailing vessels and religious ritual. Over 6 months, he reviewed anything he could find on the period. He approached it as an ex-academic looking primarily to books. He read David Muzzey's English History, John Green's A Short History of the English People, and George Cavendish's The Life of Cardinal Wolsey, a biography that was viewed as a central document of the Tudor period. These resources helped him understand how social life worked in the 1500s, allowing him to arrange scenes that felt both engaging and authentic. His goal, as he later explained, was to create a movie that interested both adults and children, and that offered a realistic presentation of royal life in Tudor England. Though ultimately, with wrestling scenes, sword fights, and multiple scenes based on period dance, the material felt far more directed at adults rather than at children. During these months, Watkin sensed that his role at the Disney studio was changing, particularly with Walt. Though initially Watkin had taken assignments from Walt without much discussion, their relationship now expanded to the point where they batted ideas back and forth. One afternoon, Watkin pitched Walt an idea for a picture based on the tales of King Arthur as the basis for a future Disney RKO UK project, only to be told, "Larry, I read Mark Twain when I was a boy, and I knew what he was talking about, but I never did understand what those knights were doing banging each other around." Another time, Watkin pitched Walt an idea based on a friend's novel that he thought would make a perfect Disney picture. The novel, The Mudlark, was the story of a young English orphan who meets Queen Victoria. "Larry," Walt said, "let 20th Century Fox do subtleties." Watkin left the meeting somewhat confused and sought the advice of a longtime Disney artist. "If you expect Walt to make sense, he'll drive you crazy," Watkin was told. "We've had all kinds of writers in here, big-time playwrights, famous novelists, even Aldous Huxley, and none of them could cut it. They tried to be Walt Disney. You just keep throwing your stuff at 'em, and some of it will stick." Watkin's main project for the early months of 1952 remained The Sword and the Rose. Once again, the script was largely written at the Burbank studio, with Watkin working under Walt's direction. Once sections were approved, they were sent to Ken Anakin in London. As Larry fed us the script pages from Burbank, he said, "I worked alongside Stephen Grimes, a young British sketch artist who had been discovered by Carmen Dillon. For 4 months, we broke down the scenes into setups and sketches." For this production, Anakin worked with Dillon and Grimes at Pinewood Studios, which was about 5 miles away from Denham. Drawings again were sent back and forth from London to Burbank. If Walt happened to be in London, he took a particular interest in the sketches, as those would not only define sets, but also camera positions and the staging of actors. "Walt used to come across at lunchtime," Anakin explained, "and look at what we'd developed, and he would say, 'Yes, yes, yes, that's going well,' or 'I don't think that works terribly well,' or 'Why don't we try to do this, this, and this?'" Despite the incident with the arrow, Richard Todd again insisted on performing his own stunts, which included horse riding, climbing down from a tower, battling with swords, and a fight that began in a rowboat and expanded once everyone fell overboard into the river. Todd also needed to learn multiple 16th century dances. "For weeks I'd been limbering up on the parallel bars," Todd explained. "I've had fencing lessons, I've polished up my writing, and then I had to learn these intricate dances." Though Watkin was formerly credited for his screenplays, his role at the studio now extended far beyond that of a mere writer. For The Sword and the Rose, he accompanied Pierce and director Ken Anakin on a trip to Paris to cast actors and actresses for French characters included in the film. They stayed at the George V Hotel, about a block from the River Seine, an elegant building that was often filled with upper-class American tourists. The 3 men were decidedly middle-aged. Anakin was 37, Watkin 51, and Pierce 53. The assumption at the studio was that these 3 men were mostly settled with their families. This was true for Watkin. This was somewhat true for Anakin, though he had had a couple of quiet affairs. But most at the studio assumed that this was most true for Pierce, who had not only been married for 2 decades, but had a grown daughter who was then married to producer Stanley Kramer, a rising star at Columbia Pictures. Pierce, with his felt hat, silvery mustache, and mostly bald scalp, looked more like a grandfather than an agent of Hollywood. But for some unknown reason, he gradually saw this trip to Paris as his one, perhaps only, opportunity to break out of the role he'd established for himself at the studio, as the quiet-spoken, occasionally comic representative of Walt. The trip, which included more people than necessary, was clearly given to these men as a reward for their hard work on previous UK features. The Disney group had fun on a generous expense account, Anakin explained. Between appointments, we slipped out and saw the sights, ate at Fouquet's, the Tour d'Argent, and the fabulous restaurant Claremont beside the River Seine. At night, we'd go down to Pigalle and see what were then considered naughty French cabarets. Quartier Pigalle included the famous red light district filled with bars, nightclubs, and burlesque shows. It was once home to the famous Moulin Rouge. The men together saw dancing girls, had drinks, and sang songs. At one cabaret, Pierce was approached by a 20-year-old young woman whose name or stage name was Monique. Watkin and Anakin looked on in wonder as Pierce and Monique attempted to converse with bits of English and bits of French. As far as Watkin and Anakin could tell, they were flirting. She sat on Pierce's knee, Anakin recalled. I don't think anything like this had ever happened to him before. Again, Watkin and Anakin stared, genuinely confused, as Monique appeared to be romantically taken with Pierce and his endless stories about working at the Disney studio, even though she spoke very little English. It's possible that her inability to speak English helped the situation, as both Watkin and Anakin thought Pierce's stories were quite often tedious. When we left, Anakin explained, just before dawn, he brought her back to his suite at the George V. He established her there without apparently having any worries that we might split on him to his wife. Neither Watkin nor Anakin had ever seen this side of Pierce. In fact, they suspected that Pierce had never seen this side of himself either. In the 2 days that followed, Anakin said, we saw much less of Pierce, and when we left, Monique accompanied him to the airport, kissing, cuddling, and promising him, in the few words of English that she had learned, that she would come to London as soon as she had mastered the linguaphone course he had bought her. This final detail seemed unbelievable to Watkin and Anakin, as they both knew that at times Pierce's wife, June, stayed with him in London. But much to their relief, Pierce never mentioned Monique again, nor did she show up in England as they were filming The Sword and the Rose. Most importantly, no one mentioned this to Walt, as that would have been a disaster. He expected everyone who worked for him to be above reproach. Anakin explained, no scandal under any circumstances. This episode, however, did help solidify bonds between the three men, as they now held each other's secrets. In fact, most of the UK company now felt a unique closeness with each other, as it was rare for actors and crew to move from one film to the next, much in the manner of a repertory company. There was a very special quality of working on a Disney film in England, Richard Todd explained, quite unlike the atmosphere on any other production. There was very much a family ambiance, a feeling of harmony, partly engendered by Pierce's avuncular presence, partly arising from the fact that most of us had worked together and knew each other well, but mostly, perhaps due to the smoothness with which the schedule rolled along as a result of the careful pre-planning of the previous weeks. Production of this film went smoothly. They shot at Pinewood Studios, a studio slightly smaller than Denham. The costumes were beautiful, as they were designed by Carmen Dillon. The dance sequences had been choreographed with an eye toward historical accuracy. Some dances reflected the distant elegance of the royal court, while other dances, led by Charles Brandon, the commoner who Mary Tudor loved, held the bawdry exuberance of a country pub. Again, Watkins' dialogue gestured to period speech without replicating it. One scene even included characters reciting their feelings as a sonnet. Shortly before the crew was set to film one shot with a sonnet, Anakin took Watkin aside to see if he might rewrite this material with more contemporary dialogue. "Larry," he said, "I can't ask an actor to say that." "Why not?" Watkin replied. "It's a traditional sonnet, very much part of courtship at that time. But it just won't play." Anakin briefly lifted his hands in frustration, then let them fall palms flat against his legs. By this point, Watkin knew that there were a few ways to persuade Anakin to keep the film as scripted. The first was to challenge his ability as a director. "Well, look," Watkin started, "let me take over this one scene for you." Watkin had once taught poetry in college and could coach two actors so the lines would sound natural, or as natural as they could sound within the conventions of 16th century England. "No," Anakin said, "but if it means so much to you." Again, Watkin cut him off. His second step was to reposition the issue as not concerning him, but concerning Walt. By now, most of the crew had seen that Watkin had a certain closeness with Walt. They explored ideas together, ideas that originated both with Walt and Watkin, whereas with others, Walt largely explained his own vision so they would be able to carry it out. Watkin explained that he didn't give a hoot in hell one way or the other if the sonnet was kept in the picture. "But I happen to know," he added, "that Walt does." This was entirely a fabrication. Watkin had no idea what Walt thought of the sonnet material in the script, and he was hoping that this lie wouldn't come back later to bite him in the butt. At best, he thought the sonnet scene was okay, especially as Walt had reviewed the entire script. Watkin watched as Anakin considered this, likely trying to decide if he was being played. Eventually, Anakin decided that the safest path forward was simply to use the script, sonnet and all, which had been approved by Walt. On set, he directed Richard Todd to take small, thoughtful breaks while reading the sonnet to give the impression that he was composing it in the moment. Overall, shooting went well. Walt visited England twice during production, and he was starting to relax more around the UK team as he came to trust them. There were no large issues, such as there had been during the production of Treasure Island when Bobby Driscoll was deported and when Perce Pierce oversaw film editing in London. The costumes now were realistic and beautiful. Painter Peter Ellenshaw created over 70 mats for the production, transforming modern landscapes into visions of 16th century England filled with castles, villages, and ships. Richard Todd danced as well as the professional dancers on stage. He also did his own stunts, which increased the realism of the film. The production went so well that before shooting ended, the core team was hired for yet another picture that would begin production the following summer, another period drama, the story of Rob Roy, an 18th century Scottish rebel. During the months the film was in production, there were only a few minor issues. The first concerned a union dispute. Electricians unhappy with work conditions at Pinewood would occasionally shut off the power to the sound stages, temporarily leaving everyone in darkness. Disney was hit more than other production units as electricians believed that The Sword and the Rose was the most expensive project then at Pinewood Studios and therefore the best target. Individual electricians, while working above on a catwalk, occasionally dropped wrenches, an action they could later claim was an accident, though clearly it was designed to cause disruption. One of these wrenches clipped the side of Anakin's head. "I was knocked out for perhaps a minute, then rushed to the local hospital," he said. "X-rays showed no crack in my skull, and in 5 hours I was back on the stage directing." But with this, half a day of shooting was lost. The second concerned an on-set accident. At the very end of production, when filming material that would be featured in various trailers, a crew captured a shot of Richard Todd riding in quickly on his horse. Though he'd spent weeks working on his equestrian skills, Todd was thrown from the horse, hit a wall, and broke 3 ribs. He needed to spend days in the hospital and then rest for weeks, but as filming for the feature proper was finished, it was only a small problem. A trailer could be arranged with other shots. Richard Todd only needed to recover by the following summer when the Disney team would shoot Rob Roy. Though Anakin did some initial edits in England, the film was shipped back to Burbank where Walt once more would oversee the final cut. The film proved to be more of a personal project for Walt than anything else. It lacked a complex villain such as Long John Silver. It also lacked an angle to present the project as a family film that would interest children. The story, as Anakin put it, went over the heads of Disney's usual American kiddies audience. Most at the studio sensed that the film would be reasonably well received. James Robertson Justice, who played Henry VIII, was outstanding, but they also sensed that the film would be nowhere near as profitable as Treasure Island or Robin Hood. When a final cut of the film was ready, Walt asked a few people, including Larry Watkin, over to his house in Holmby Hills, about a 15-minute drive from the studio, to view it. Perce Pierce was almost surely invited along with his wife June, with whom he had now settled back into a semblance of a traditional marriage. Walt's house was on a double lot. The top lot held the house, a lawn, and a well-tended rose garden, and the bottom lot held Walt's 1/8 scale garden railroad, along with a barn where he stored and worked on the train. That night the train wasn't running, but people could still see the elaborate track layout and the miniature plants, a locomotive setup similar to those Walt had visited while in England. The event that night was held indoors, in rooms also filled with elements to entertain friends. Well, he had a game room filled with theater seats where he often ran movies, Watkin recalled. In the back of the room was a soda fountain where Walt acted as soda jerk. He'd give you a real drink if you insisted, but he loved making his guests big gooey sundaes with any kind of syrup they wanted before taking their seats. Watkin took his seat not far from Walt and watched as the room grew dark. The film began with the words Walt Disney Presents, superimposed over a painting of the principal characters, Henry VIII, Mary Tudor, and Charles Brandon, standing in a field with a castle behind them. The canvas was arranged in the style of a Renaissance painting. Not long after this, Watkin saw his name in large letters for the screenplay credit. Then came the story. The drama opened with Henry VIII, overseeing a wrestling match between English athletes and a few from France, a scene in which Mary Tudor met her future love, Charles Brandon. About halfway through the film, during the scene with the sonnet that Anakin wanted to cut, Watkin heard a sound he hadn't expected. "I heard someone sniffling," he said. "I turned and sure enough it was Walt crying over that sonnet. I couldn't believe it." Watkin sat there watching Walt, one of the most famous men in Hollywood, visibly moved by the words he had written. There was a small dampness around his eyes. After the film ended, Walt sought out Watkin. "You should write more poetry. I never hear that without it bringing a tear to the eye." It was one of the highest compliments Walt had ever paid Watkin. Almost surely, Watkin regretted that Anakin wasn't there to hear it, that the lie Watkin had told overseas turned out to be true. Walt loved that sonnet, but Anakin wouldn't see the final film until it premiered in England. By this point, Walt felt a closeness with his UK production team, even the actors. When he was in New York, he called up Richard Todd, who was there as well, and asked if Todd wanted to come with him to Coney Island. Todd thought it was an unusual request. "I didn't like to say no," he later explained, "but I mean, Coney Island wasn't exactly my cup of tea." Once there, they went on rides. They walked around and watched the crowd. "And then he told me why," Todd said. "He was going to build a Disneyland." Though Todd had little idea as to how this Disneyland would be different than a typical amusement park. But Todd didn't ask about this. Instead, he enjoyed this strange and unusual day with Walt. "We went on everything together," he said. "We had a hell of a day there, and we were eating these big candy floss things, you know. Had a great day." At the studio, it was clear that Walt now wanted to expand Disney's live-action productions. The UK experiment had started primarily as a means to spend down block British funds, but now that Walt had finished these productions, he had more confidence in his ability to create live-action films at the Burbank studio. A few months earlier, in a 1951 memo, Roy Disney had outlined some projects he believed would perform well as live-action features. Among them was the story of a boy who turns into a sheepdog, a comedy then called The Hound of Florence, but much later would be called The Shaggy Dog. Another was a project then called Rebel Raiders, a Civil War story about Southern soldiers who sabotage a railroad. This project would later have the name The Great Locomotive Chase. Yet another simply had the name The Sam Taylor Stories, which were a set of short stories about an eccentric inventor, a project that later would be called The Absent-Minded Professor. But Walt had another idea for his first live-action feature produced in America. He understood the basic parameters for how to make this decision, building on the studio's recent releases. It needed to play well for a family audience. It should have elements familiar to UK and European markets, and most of all, the story needed to be one that interested him. As source material, Walt eventually settled on a 19th century French novel written by Jules Verne. The project would have a different overall tone and presentation than those period dramas written by Watkin. Not long after Watkin finished work on Sword in the Rose, Walt felt him out for this new project without mentioning the French novel by name. Watkin's own novels were either realistic fiction, realistic fantasy, or historical dramas. One afternoon, Walt asked what Watkin thought of science fiction. Without considering it much, Watkin simply said, "I have no great enthusiasm for it." The conversation ended there. Only later did Watkin learn that Walt was considering him for 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, the first big-budget live-action picture produced by Disney in America, a film that would have top Hollywood stars such as Kirk Douglas, James Mason, and Peter Lorre. "I would not have said I didn't like science fiction if I had known he was offering me the chance to do 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea," Watkin said. But that ship, he knew, had now sailed. Watkin, however, didn't need to worry much about his future at the Disney studio. Walt would have other fascinating projects, stories that had interested him for years, and now, in the mid-1950s, believed that Larry Watkin was the exact right person to develop them. I'll be back next week with a new episode. Our plan right now, at least, is to post our monthly news and analysis episode next Sunday, and then to continue our story about Larry Watkin and Walt Disney the Sunday after that. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who support us on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 200 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us on Bandcamp is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can become a monthly supporter at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. Until then, this is Todd James Pierce.